Hey, welcome to The Conversation. My name is Kyle, and I'm coming to you from the First Colony Church of Christ in Sugar Land, Texas. Thanks for joining me, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the year 2022. Can you believe it? We have made it. We survived another year. You are here. We're together, and I pray and hope that your year is filled with good things and that it is filled with hope and blessing and success. Thanks for joining me today on the first conversation of 2022. We're starting a new teaching series here on The Conversation for the next couple of weeks, probably more than a couple of weeks, for the next few weeks anyway. It's called Margin. The new teaching series is called Margin. I think that's a good way to start 2022, so we're going to jump right in. Tell me, go ahead and log into the chat if you can, and tell us, if you don't mind, if you don't mind being too personal, tell us what is a major source of stress for you right now in your life. Go ahead and log into the chat. Let us know what a major source of stress for you right now is. In fact, we'll be happy to pray for you in this season of stress. If you don't mind us doing that, you can request prayer, you can talk to us, or some of our staff members can get in touch with you. But log into the chat and let us know what is a major stressor in your life right now. Stress is a common word in 2022. It's been a common word for the past couple of years, actually, through the course of a very long and tiring and grueling pandemic. That has nothing to say about those who have been affected personally and physically with COVID-19, but as a society, as culture, as Americans, and even globally, we have experienced a tremendous amount of stress the past couple of years. And in fact, we're probably looking for some of that to end pretty shortly. Let me give you a rundown of some headlines. I just did a basic search today on stress and Americans. And I want to read to you what we are experiencing as Americans due to the current pandemic. The first is the remarks about the stress level in Generation Z. Generation Z are those in America who are between the ages of 13 and 24. What a new study revealed that's current, it's within the past couple of months, is that 38% of Gen Z Americans felt their family and their other personal relationships were major sources of stress. 37% of Gen Zs said that they feel stress about the uncertainty of how this pandemic will affect their future. 65%, so these are teenagers and college-aged Americans. 65% of Gen Z said that when it came to education, that education was extremely important to their identity. But 46% of Gen Zs actually said that the pandemic has made it more difficult for them to pursue their career goals through education. This is a pretty serious epidemic. In fact, it's targeted specifically at the pandemic. We're not talking about other stressors, but pandemic-related stresses have made the current state of stress in Gen Z Americans pop through the roof. Here's another headline. Let me read you this one. A new survey shows, this is recent too. In fact, it's as recent as December 14th of 2021. A new survey shows that only 42% of Americans feel optimistic about post-pandemic life. Now, I'm not going to read the nuts and bolts of the story, but you get a sense, because that's probably where you are, that most people don't necessarily feel optimistic about life when the pandemic ends, or if they're even confident it will end at all. Here's a third headline. 70% of Americans are stressed about their financial situation. An overwhelming majority, 70% of Americans, are stressed about their financial situations. Only 30%, let me give you the antithesis of this, only 30% of people reporting having no anxiety through the course of 2021. In other words, you and I live in a stressed out culture, a stressed out society. Our neighborhoods are stressed out. Our commutes are filled with drivers who are stressed. We're probably some of those too. So let's go ahead and confess right quick, right? It's hard to drive right now. There's a general sense of uncertainty and anxiety even in driving. When we visit businesses, we sense a feeling of anxiety and pressure. In other words, you and I have been pushed into a life that is consumed with anxiety and stress. And by the way, you need to go ahead and give yourself a break, okay? Because if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling anxious about the current state of life here in America, you are not alone. Most people feel the same thing. So to me, it became a necessary topic for us here on the conversation to not necessarily talk about stress, but to talk about margin. We need to talk about margin here on the conversation, because margin is the space between our pace of life and our own limitations. That little space between pace and limits is margin. And that's what we're going to talk about that here in the conversation over the next few weeks. How to refocus and understand the necessity of margin in our lives. You know, if we would have brought this up pre-pandemic levels, right? Pre-pandemic society. If we were to talk about margin, we would have talked a considerable amount about pace, about ambition, about busyness, full schedules. But here in the middle of a pandemic, that conversation has to change, because while we are experiencing stressful situations that may be of our own doing, we are also feeling stressors from outside of our situations, things that we can't necessarily control. And so we're finding ourselves in a vise that pushes us to our limits. And we need to talk about margin. We need to talk about the necessity of margin in our life, because right now, right here in 2022, we need to think about margin this way. Margin is actually embracing our limits. Margin is about embracing our limits. It's not only about embracing our personal limitations, the things that we know that we cannot do. Margin is also about embracing the limits that are imposed upon us by outside forces. Now, you're probably already thinking this is a little out there and probably not worthy of a 25, 30-minute conversation, but it absolutely is. Because right now we are living in a situation where outside stressors can directly affect the course of our lives. People are still grappling with employment issues because of the pandemic. People are still grappling with family issues because of the pandemic. It might be you. It might be you. You might be dealing with both of those. Things that we didn't design, but things that happened to us. So I want to encourage us over the next few weeks to flip our perception of these limitations and maybe start embracing them. Maybe finding some blessing and some peace in those. Living life constantly ignoring these limits leads to an extremely stressful day. In fact, it amps the stress that we already feel. We need to find some peace in the limitations. So that's what we're going to talk about here. And here's why. Because really, embracing margin is really an opportunity to embrace our faith in God. We have personal limitations and outside limitations, things that we can control and things that we can't control. So in that formula, we have to find some peace there. We have to find a way to embrace where we are and to learn to trust God in spite and because of those limits. I don't think living in a stressed out way is any way to live. It robs us of peace. It robs us of joy. It robs us of worship. It robs us of community, and it robs us of fellowship. And I think what God is saying to us with our personal limits and with outside stressors, with our outside limits, is I think he's saying something he's always said. He's saying, trust me. Trust me. It's okay to trust me. I want you to trust me. Why do we live? Why do we live to our limits anyway? Why do we live focused on our limitations? Why do we, in our personal situation, why do we maximize ourselves? Why do we do this to ourselves? And with outside stressors, why do we give that so much credibility? Well, this is why I think we do that. I think that we do this because of fear. So let's talk about both of these. Let's talk about personal limitations here and maximizing our entire capacity with work, with relationships, moving at the speed of light in all of these situations, and disregarding our own mental health and our own emotional well-being and our own spiritual formation at the expense of that. Why do we do this? Why do we live to our absolute limits? Well, I think we do that because we find our self-worth in how much we can do. So again, we're only talking about personal limits here. We're not talking about outside stressors. We're talking about our own personal capacity. We max ourselves out because we find some identity in that. We can work harder, we can earn more, we can do more. Now, by the way, this conversation and this series is not criticizing ambition. It's not criticizing success. It's not doing any of those things, but it is helping us refocus what we are missing when we do max out our capacity. That sounds like a misnomer, right? That we actually miss something when we do that. Well, we absolutely miss something when we do that because we're finding our identity in how busy we are and how successful we are. Now, focusing on outside stressors gives us a completely different perception of what it means to find margin, because when we are so focused on the daily headlines, the next bit of bad news, the email that comes into your inbox that gives you some devastating information about your career or your job, focusing on things that we can't control also tempts us to find our self-worth in focusing on those things, even though we can't control them. And you're probably wondering, well, how does that how does that maximize our own personal self-worth? Well, for one thing, it opens the door for us to complain and to offer solutions to an empty room, right? We can tell people that we know, or we can think that we have optimal solutions to create different outcomes. So all of a sudden it gives us it interrupts our lives and gives us an identity crisis, because if we don't have an outlet, a personal outlet, we find our outlet on social media. We decide to post about things and post news stories and offer opinions that incite bad dialogue in spaces where that shouldn't happen. And so we find ourselves in an indirect way focusing on outside stressors because of the way that it gives us, or it makes us, or gives us some perception of credibility. We know we can't change it. We can't alter outside stressors, but we can alter the course of other people's day by making sure that our opinion is the loudest and the most prominent. And we find ways to post things on social media that makes that very unglorifying to God. Doesn't mean we can't have opinions, right? But it does mean that the only way that we can combat outside stressors, things that are not in our control, is to engage conversations with people with whom we disagree, because it makes us feel better, gives us some credibility. It feels like our self-worth is growing, it's getting better. We find our identity in maximizing ourselves. We find our identity in that because we're afraid. We're afraid of what would happen on a personal level if we if we didn't max out our capacity. And we're also afraid of people's perception of us, our political perceptions, our political opinions, our medical opinions, especially in a pandemic, if we don't make sure everyone knows exactly what we're thinking. So we find ourselves in this really odd state beginning 2022, fighting against the need for absolute margin in our life. Did you know that the Lord actually has a solution for maximizing our capacity? Whether it is personal limitations or outside stressors. You know what it is. It's called the Sabbath. It's called the Sabbath. So you remember, let's do some Old Testament dialoguing just for a minute. So when the Lord rescued his people from Egypt, when he rescued them from slavery, remember that story in Exodus? And he creates from them a brand new nation. What he does is he gives them some laws, and you can find the first 10 of those in Exodus chapter 20. They're called the 10 Commandments. That's no surprise. Did you know that one of the top 5 commandments, one of the first few, is God's specific commandment to honor the Sabbath? In other words, to take one specific day and to not work. Now, this would be a very surprising development and a surprising law for former slaves who had worked their entire life every single day, and now they're building a nation, they're building a culture, they're building families and communities, and there's no such thing as savings or some social security network. You can't take a day off. If you take a day off, your ability to survive completely diminishes. You work constantly 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Every available moment that you have to work, you work. But God says, when we're going to build this nation, we will not work one day. In fact, it is a law that you have to take one day off. Listen to this. This is Exodus chapter 20. I'm going to start reading in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and you shall do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, listen to this prohibition, neither you nor your son or your daughter or your male or your female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he, even he, rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and he made it holy. Can you imagine a group of people building a brand new civilization, hearing that there is a prohibition against working? That would be one of the greatest laws ever, right? I mean, can you imagine that passing modern legislation? There is one day that you will absolutely not work. This would have been an ultimate anxiety-inducing law. But the Sabbath is God's way of saying to his people, trust me. Trust me. This idea of trust is actually built into the Old Testament ethos. In Leviticus 19, there is a pretty famous law. We don't talk about it much. It's called the law of gleaning. And as they were building a civilization, the Lord actually gave them a law that said, when you gather your crops in from the fields, you don't gather everything. You don't gather everything in every corner. You leave some, and you leave some actually for those who are poor and dispossessed. Now, modern day equivalent, the Lord is saying you got to leave some money on the table here. You can't gather every single thing that you've worked to grow. There is some that has to be left over for the poor. Now, you and I will see this in a very natural way, that there are people in society that need the benefits of our wealth, of our generosity. But the flip side of that is that for people who have worked their entire lives every single day, for God to come in and say, let's not gather everything. That would be an anxiety-inducing law, right? But God is using these laws to teach his people about trust, about margin, about limits. There's only so much you can do. You can't do everything. Think of the magnificence of margin and Sabbath. Just for a minute. Think about a God who comes to you and says, I want you to embrace your limits. I want you to realize that you can't do everything. I want you to reckon that with yourself and trust me for the difference. I want you to believe in me more than you believe in yourself. Can you imagine how that would affect our relationships, our finances, how it would affect our careers? Now this is not necessarily an Old Testament principle, though. In fact, we see it carried over all the way into the New Testament. In fact, in Mark chapter 2, in one of the early controversies against Jesus and his disciples, Jesus is actually questioned about the Sabbath day. I want you to listen to this. This is from Mark chapter 2. I'm going to start reading from verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? In other words, the Pharisees are saying, these guys are working on the Sabbath. And Jesus answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need in the days of Abiathar, the high priest? He entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave them to some of his companions. And then Jesus said something interesting that almost seems counterintuitive here. But he says in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And Jesus is answering a critique why his disciples are working on the Sabbath. And Jesus says something that seems counterproductive to our conversation here. He's saying, look, these guys have every right to feed themselves. But I want you to get one thing straight, Pharisees. This is a law that is made for people. And you don't have the right to determine what that day looks like in people's lives. So for our conversation, Jesus is essentially saying, these guys will take a Sabbath rest, but they're not going to take it today because today there is something that they need to do. So Jesus, in a very counterintuitive way, embraces the necessity of Sabbath by subtracting it from a specific day. That's what Jesus does, right? He's saying you don't get to idolize one specific day, but you do need to make sure that a Sabbath is necessary because it's made for people. It's made for you. In other words, you and I don't have to observe a specific day and a specific day off, but we do. Honoring the Sabbath in our lives and embracing margin is actually a way of saying there are things that I, number one, cannot do. Even though I try to do them, I have to understand and embrace these limits. There are things I can't do. And number two, there are things I can't control. And in that marriage, you and I begin to embrace margin because in that space between those, that's where faith develops. That's where faith is grown. It's grown right there. It's the Lord telling us to trust him. There's even a larger theological component to Sabbath in the New Testament. It's found in Hebrews chapter 4. I'm going to read this to you. Listen to how the New Testament church saw margin. Therefore, I'm going to start in verse 1. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering the Lord's rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they didn't share the faith of those who obeyed. Let's skip to verse 6. Let's go to verse 3. Now we who have believed, we enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet, his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere, he's spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. A couple more verses left here. For Joshua had given them rest. God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains, this is verse 9 of Hebrews chapter 4, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. The meta idea of Sabbath in the New Testament went from just being understanding margin in our personal lives, but understanding it on a macro level. That the idea of grace, of forgiveness, is the same idea as Sabbath was in the Old Testament. Did you know that in the first 6 days of creation, you can read it in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, there's a morning and an evening to those days. But when you get to the seventh day of God's creation, when you get to the day of his rest, listen to this in Genesis chapter 2. When you get to this seventh day, there is no evening. It's very poetic, but it's here. Listen to Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished his work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and he made it holy because on it he rested from all his work of creating all he had done. That's why in Hebrews chapter 4, today is called the seventh day. It's called today. This idea of a Sabbath rest has been built into creation since the seventh day of creation. This is not a concept that shows up in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. It's not a concept that shows up in Jesus' teaching in Mark chapter 2. Hebrews 4 says that this has existed since the seventh day, since the last moment of God's creative acts. I want you and I to think about margin. I want you to think about embracing margin. What is it going to take for us to embrace margin in our relationships? What is it going to take to embrace margin in our spiritual formation? To understand that there are things that we cannot do. We need to stop maximizing our capacity because we're finding our self-worth in our busyness, and we're doing this out of fear. We have to stop that. And we have to stop obsessing over things that we can't control, because God is saying to us right here at the beginning of 2022, he's saying to us that he wants us to trust him. He wants us to trust him in our relationships. He wants us to trust him in our careers, in our finances. There are things that we cannot do. There are built-in limits to our life. We need to understand those, and we also need to know that there are changes that could happen on a day, there could be changes that happen every day. External stressors that alter the course of our lives that we can't control. It's time for us to embrace the margin. So I want you to stick around the next few weeks while we talk about margin. We're going to talk about margin in all of these specific places. Thank you so much for joining me today right here in the conversation. If you've got a question along the way, be sure to let our moderators know in our chat. They'll give me that question and we'll address it in the next few weeks. But Happy New Year again to you. Welcome back to the conversation. I'm looking forward to a great teaching series. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day, everyone.